So welcome. Thank you, Crispin, for joining us from Vancouver, formerly Portland.
Yeah,
She's a
no
Portlandite
problem.
still. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
um, but first, it would be great to just talk a bit about your background in the industry and, perhaps even a bit about the role you had at Nike prior to Lululemon and kind of how you got to where you are and what the scope of your current role is would be great.
Yeah, yeah, maybe I'll give just a quick maybe tour through my career because I think it all kind of added up to where I am today.
Yeah, perfect.
Um, I started out more in science. I studied chemistry, thought I was going to go into environmental toxicology. Um, Started my first job was actually in science and realized quickly that that was not for me, that I did not like working in a lab, and pivoted more towards applied science and went to graduate school for environmental science. Um, After that, I ended up in the energy industry, which was a commonplace if you studied environmental economics, and but knew that I was really interested in the apparel industry. I think this was quite a while ago. At a time in the industry where most people were still thinking mostly about social compliance, and I was really curious about where all of the clothes were going because I was shocked when I really started digging in and seeing how much was being produced in the apparel industry. This was like back in 2005. Um, and what knew that I wanted to get into the apparel and footwear industry eventually. So ended up doing some work very similar to what you guys are doing in online courses and made a connection and ended up getting hired at Nike to work on supply chain and manufacturing programs in chemistry and wastewater, and really looking at the materials supply chain, which was super interesting, super relevant to today's course. So I got a deep dive, kind of learned materials backwards from the chemistry up. Um, and then just really wanted to get more of a business view. I had spent most of my time in the sustainability space and wanted to really understand what it was more like from a business perspective and moved into a job in sourcing at Nike. So I led the material sourcing strategy for apparel and accessories at Nike, which was an amazing experience, and definitely a good experience to understand how all of the decisions come together, not just the sustainability ones, but all of the cost, capacity, capability, all the other things that you need to consider when you're thinking about where materials come from. I wanted to get back to sustainability, and that one thing led to another, and I ended up at Lululemon. And my current role is leading Lululemon's portfolio of initiatives around product sustainability and the environment. So that includes product sustainability and materials, supporting the teams in that space, circularity, um, waste and packaging, our vendor environmental program, and climate action. So, kind of a broad scope of environmental projects that are all very, very interrelated, and all very dependent on materials.
So next question, just since we're talking about materials specifically, just the general question of how Lululemon approaches sustainable materials and kind of what are your priority materials, I guess, to start at Lululemon, then kind of how are you addressing your key priorities?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So in our impact reports, we have this information, and I think starting out with what our key priority materials are is a good place to start because it's slightly different than a lot of other brands in that our biggest fiber that we need to solve for is nylon. Because women's bottoms or pants are such a huge part of our portfolio. So that's a little bit different in that it's the bigger share of what we need to be working on. And then, of course, the usual suspects with polyester, elastin, and cotton. And then, of course, we have parts of our portfolio that are cellulosic based, like Tencel. But uh, the bulk of it is in those major fibers, which is very similar for a lot of companies in the industry. And then part two to that question was, I don't have the questions up in front of me, was how we approach.
Yeah, how you approach, or then what are kind of, how do you approach the priorities within those kind of top material categories, or how do you approach sustainability within those top material categories? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the work, and I wouldn't, not just for Lululemon, but I would say for a lot of companies in the industry, really looking at the impact data, because if we are making claims that we are moving towards a preferred material or a better alternative, it needs to be backed up by data. Um, and we really need to understand what that value proposition is. And so I would say that that's a foundation of assessing and understanding how to prioritize and what to go after. Um, the second piece that I would say that's really important to consider is where it is in its commercial scalability, especially if you're not a small brand. If you're actually doing some sizable volume, you really need to understand where it is in that innovation development or in the innovation pipeline, and where you could use it in a scale or in a smaller capacity, because you need to have, I would say, different uh, technologies lined up, that some of them, they're not perfect, but they're available. And that might be good for today, but you need to be thinking about, what do I need in 2 years? What do I need in 4 years? What do I need 6? And at this point with climate goals, we need to be thinking about what we need in 10 years, which is, I think, a bit of a shift in the industry. We've always looked at innovation, but I would say the innovation time horizons and sustainability are getting longer, because we're needing more and more low carbon materials that don't exist today. So it's both exciting and challenging to really understand what's available, and to address the challenges, like the criticisms that people have. Everyone has their opinion, and you just have to understand why you're making the decisions and be able to defend them, and know that you're never going to have the perfect choice. There's always trade-offs.
There are no real satisfactory answers in this field to the question of what's the most sustainable material, or what's the best choice that I have. And it's sort of like, look at the data, determine what's important to you,
Yeah.
or to your company, or to your point of view, and then you make decisions accordingly, backed up with data, but that can look different. And then what are you comparing it against is the other question. So
No, for sure. And I think it's an interesting paradox in that the most sustainable product is probably the one that you don't buy. But the thing that I love about this industry is that, I mean, I guess you don't have to wear clothes, but for most of us, we do. It is
yeah.
a necessity. And that's what I find so interesting, is that it is both a luxury as well as a necessity. And so it's just an interesting thing to think about, in how you provide for that and make the best choices that you can.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay, so on that note, that's a good segue into most significant challenges to implementing more sustainable materials that Lululemon faces specifically.
Yeah. Um, and I'll answer a bit from my sourcing expertise, because I think that it's always a balance trying to understand how you deliver product, um, in kind of the performance that you need. So, what is it that you need it to do? Because the most preferred fiber that you could be using may not be appropriate for the end use that you want it. If you're like an NBA player, and you need something that's really high abrasion, can really withstand, other, 7-foot men grabbing onto your jersey, which is a different value proposition than lounging around in comfy sweats on a Saturday. And so I think really understanding what you're making and the purpose of it, and balancing that with the cost. What do you need? Because we can't, spend unless you can't produce, $1,000, tank top. I mean, you can, there's definitely brands that do that, but definitely not scalable or accessible to most people. Um, and then balancing all of the other business needs of like, when do you need it? Where in the world can you make this? And stringing together the supply chains. And so I think the challenges come in just trying to understand the right level of overlap between all of those circles, and which ones you might have to trade off, or sacrifice a little bit, which may mean sometimes that the best alternative that you're looking for won't work, for what you originally thought it would, or it won't work because you can't scale it in the region that you need it. So I would say, um, playing with those tensions is always the biggest challenge. Um, the other thing that I would say that's more process based is really trying to integrate into processes. So I mean, this industry has existed for thousands of years. And so sometimes when we're talking about introducing a new material, or really talking about different processes, it's really hard to get people's minds to shift, because there's such an entrenched way of thinking in this industry, both in how we produce, but then sometimes even within a company, how the product creation processes work. And I would say that that's often a challenge, is just, where do you insert, how do you train everyone? You're trying to shift thousands of people working on product. How do you get information into everybody's hands so that they can make decisions? Because this is not something that happens with one or two people working on the outside. It has to be integrated into everybody's job, everybody's decision making. So I would say that's a challenge that I always come up against, is how do you get information into people's hands?
A little bit outside the sustainable materials topic, but just in general, if you can talk about how Lululemon approaches sustainability strategy. What are the different elements of a sustainability strategy? How might you approach that from different company perspectives? So just a little bit, even just at a high level, about Lululemon sustainability strategy and what's involved, what are the key pillars of that would be great.
Yeah, for sure. I'll speak a little bit into our strategy and how we frame it, and
Yeah.
then maybe give a few more, general thoughts on what to consider in a strategy.
Yeah.
So our sustainability strategy is organized into three pillars. The way that it's structured is, under three banners called, Be Human, Be Well, and Be Planet. And they're all very interconnected, because Be Well is focused on promoting, well-being, and disrupting inequity in access to well-being tools, which is really exciting. And there's a lot of connection and a lot of, emerging science that's really looking at how there's a connection between well-being and access to outdoors and activity, as well as how things like climate change create stress on mental health. So I think there's a lot of connection between these pillars. Be Human focuses, on, both internally within the company, but also externally in the supply chain, and looking at our makers. So all of the people who make our products in factories, and, going after, the fair labor accreditation. And then B Planet is all of the areas that I listed earlier, around product sustainability goals, um, both kind of overall with our product, as well as fiber sub targets, that have a lot of connection into the textile exchange, and how they look at preferred fibers. And, looking at circularity, looking at our climate goals. We have a science-based target, as many companies do, and reducing single-use plastics, things like that. So that's kind of just a quick overview of Lululemon's overall framework for sustainability. I think within that, then, is a bit of a, each of those areas is really meaty and needs a strategy against it as well. And I think the way that our team thinks about it, and the way that I often think about it, is really thinking through, what is that end result that you want for something, specific. Like, I'll take our vendor environmental program, for example, is what are we aiming for? What are the key focus areas? And what, for example, acting on climate, reducing water, and improving chemistry, things like that. Really thinking what are those focus areas that you're trying to do to make it very clear to the audience that this is what we're going after. Um, I think the other thing that I would say more specific to product and materials, I think you need a component of, well, I might take that back. I think it could apply to a lot. I think you need a component of what's doable, what can we get after, what can we achieve, but then also start uh, to look at your moonshots. Like what are the things you're really going after? Um, and Beth, you'll laugh at this because I borrowed this Eric Larson, your friend, the Polar Explorer. I
Yeah.
totally ripped this off from one of his speeches, but it's served very well. Is that I always talk to my team about nearing and faring, which is something that you do when you're a Polar Explorer. Your nearing is looking at, is the iceberg breaking up in front of you? What tools do you need at the top of your pack to actually get through the next day? And the faring is when you stop and you take out your map, you take out your compass, whatever it is. He would probably be mortified at like what I'm talking about, his tools, because I'm sure it's more sophisticated than that. But you
The
make
analogy is
sure
there. Yeah.
the analogy is there, yes. But you need to make sure that you know where you're headed, and that you're thinking about the big goal, so that you don't get off course and get too focused on the near term.
Yeah.
And I think that's super important to look at, especially in sustainability, because you're working over time horizons that are much longer than anyone else in the company.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's important to remember that you need to have both of those and really be understanding citing where the industry is going, where you need to be going, where you want to lead versus where you want to follow. Um, so all super important to consider.
Yeah. How much, if at all, does consumer preference affect exploring like bigger paradigm shifts in what materials are used, or how does that affect innovation?
Yeah, I that's a great question. Um, and this is where I think going back to the comment around this industry has existed for thousands of years, and so it's harder to replace some of these fibers like cotton. I always love it when somebody's like, "Well, we'll just replace all the cotton." I'm just like, "Oh, if it was that easy, we would have done it a long time ago." Um, but yeah, I think it's super important, and I think especially if I think through the lens of innovative startups who are making materials, I think the key advice that I would give those companies is to really pressure test and study the market and understand what end use you're trying to use your material for. Are you trying to make it fit for purpose for something that you would do run a marathon in, or is this more fashion based, and how does it need to drape? And I think that's sometimes the miss is that for innovation, it's brought to the table and the performance attributes haven't been fully thought through. Though I would say that everyone's getting a lot more savvy about that. So I would say that's where things get hung up, is like an intent of like, oh, we should use it for this. But then once you start putting pressure testing it and actually trying to make a garment out of it, it doesn't drape the way that it needs to, or the hand feel, you can't get it quite right. And so I think it's important to understand that consumers still make decisions off of how things feel and how they make them feel and how they look. So you can't, have the most sustainable, scratchy burlap bag. It has to feel, look nice, and perform the way it needs to. So I absolutely think that it informs what sometimes whether something gets adopted into a product or not. But I think the most successful innovations or groups that are scaling have really thought through and worked with their partners. That's, I think, the benefit of startups having partners, close brand partners, to get advice and to really develop their product into something that can meet the needs of what the industry needs it to.